Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to uh, Lean Conference India pre-conference webinars. Today we are joined with Jeff Gothelf. Jeff Gothelf is the author of Lean UX, and he helps companies and organizations to build products and cultures through his workshops and keynotes. And I've also joined with Praneeth. Praneeth is one of the US experts over here in Bangalore, and he'll be asking most of the questions on the conference behalf. Jeff, thanks a lot for giving us time that one on your vacation days.
My pleasure. I'm really happy to be here, fellows. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to spend some time.
Jeff, let me start with the basic question, and then I'll ask Fred to take it over. So, what exactly is Lean UX, and how it is different from general UX?
Sure. So it's interesting. So I don't necessarily think that Lean UX is radically different from UX, traditional UX, in that the activities in Lean UX are the same activities in regular UX, right? Quote unquote regular UX. I think the biggest difference is the depth to which we do those activities and the frequency with which we do those activities, and then lastly, who we do those activities with. So let me clarify. So when I started practicing user experience interaction design, that type of thing, about 16 or 17 years ago, it was a waterfall world, and we had the design phase, and we spent as long as we had. If it was a week, we spent a week. If it was a month or 3 months, if we were particularly lucky, we would spend the entire time designing. And that meant, wireframes and research and visual designs and prototyping and all the same types of things that we did in Lean UX, but we do in Lean UX. But the difference is that we would do it all at once, all together, with nothing but designers as participants in that process. And then we would document all of our findings in specifications documents and hand it over to engineers to then develop. And the first word out of their mouth, every single time, 100% of the time, was no. Right? Well, I'm not building it. I can't. We don't have time. It's too much. I don't understand it. Right? So that was the way we used to do it. Now, Lean UX takes all of those activities, and we still do them. We still do sketching. We still do wireframing. We still do prototyping. We still do research. But we do less of those things, or at least to a lesser extent, and we do it more often. And in the process, we involve our non-designer colleagues in those activities. So we'll do a sketching session about a small component of the work, and we'll do it with engineers and product managers. We will do research about something that we want to confirm is true or false, but we'll only do it with 3 to 5 customers, and we'll bring our engineers and our product managers or our stakeholders along with us. And by doing that, what we're doing is a few things. We're building a shared understanding, first of all, with the people who are not doing the design work about where we're going with the design, and that allows them to provide input a lot earlier in the process. They can say, that's a good idea, we can build that. Or you know what, I love that idea, but it's going to take a lot of effort, we need to figure out something else. Right? That conversation can happen a lot sooner when we're in sketches or wireframes as opposed to 3 months downstream when we've committed to a certain design. And so as you're building this conversation, you're building a collaboration, and you're building a shared understanding of the kinds of work of the work that the team actually needs to do, and you're building buy-in. And then the last thing that's happening is everybody gets to see the customer sooner and to understand why we're doing certain things and why certain decisions are being made. And that goes a long way. And so that's really the fundamental difference between Lean UX and normal UX. And it fits really nicely into an agile process. And so people say agile UX. I don't know that there's a difference between Lean UX and agile UX. I actually don't believe that there is a difference. But Lean UX, to me, is how you do UX in agile.
Right. Nice. So I think Jeff, you've already started talking about some of the advantages of Lean UX, getting the buy-in from your peers, your cross-functional teams that you're working with. But so I think as a follow-up, in terms of a lot of times, as a UXer or a design team in-house, you kind of like get buy-in to start following Lean UX. So by that I mean you need to influence your management or your developers and all to get on board to try out something called as a Lean UX or some of this Lean methodology. So do you think there's something else that you would want to add on in terms of what are the advantages and how does one go about convincing the peers, other cross-functional teams, or the management in terms of taking up something like Lean?
Yeah, so look, at the end of the day, what this is risk mitigation. And that should be attractive to everybody on the team, not just designers and not just people who believe in this way of working. This should be something that is interesting to everybody, right? We don't want to spend our time designing and building the wrong thing. We don't want to spend our time shipping products that customers don't love and don't want to use or don't know how to use. So if we can convince people that this is a form of risk mitigation, that goes a long way towards getting buy-in for this way of working, right? Let's make sure that before the designers spend a month putting every pixel in place and making sure that all the workflows make sense, let's make sure that this is a workflow we actually have to build, right? Let's make sure that this is a feature that customers will actually value or a product that they actually need. And I think that by pitching it that way, by saying, the way, so let me give you an example. The way that sometimes we sell work from a consulting point of view is somebody will say, I have a budget. Let's say it's $100,000. The budget is $100,000. And we'll say, terrific. Let's take 10% of that budget and let's spend that on learning, so that we can make sure that we spend the 90,000 on the things that actually matter, or the things that matter, that we can get a sense that matter most. And so that's the key, I think, is if you can sell it as risk mitigation, it should make an impact.
Okay, and so where does a UX team start the journey towards adopting Lean UX? So is it, so I think there are two ways to ask this, right? One is it a UX team starting to get adopting it and getting a buy-in, or is it more like a top-down approach where you need to get buy-in before you actually start doing something like this? And what's the starting point?
There has to be look, so ultimately, it has to be a team-wide and organizational-wide buy-in for for this way of working, because what it's going to require is you going to the engineers and saying, today, at least in the morning, don't write code, come talk to customers with me. And the engineering manager is going to have to say that's okay, and that type of thing. So ultimately, it has to be an organizational-wide buy-in. But I think until then, you can definitely start as a UXer doing this on your own. For example, let's say you're working on a feature or a workflow. Ask yourself, what's the minimum amount of work that I need to do to communicate these ideas to my colleagues, the engineers, or and do that amount of work, right? Can you sketch it out on a whiteboard with them during lunch? Can you, just do a hand sketch and walk it over there? Anything like that starts to show that you can start to build some kind of understanding and a feedback loop internally, and then you can take that and say, look, I'm going to take this, I'm going to show it to a few customers, right? And the same kind of feedback that you gave me, that's what I'm looking for them. And I think that by starting with those little steps, then you start to introduce the company to this way of working. Now, if that goes well, the next step is to then say, okay, listen, before we kick off this next sprint, let's do a collaborative sketching session or design studio. Like, maybe I can get 2 hours of everybody's time next Friday morning before sprint planning or something like that, and I'll run it and I'll show you guys how to do it and that type of thing. So it takes, make small attempts, see what works, and then build on those wins to try bigger and bigger things. So you can definitely start on your own, but ultimately I think it will take a broader organizational buy-in to make it all work together.
Right. So, at this point, I'd really like to jump in and, trying to see how do you do it as a UXer being in an agency outside and you're working with your clients versus somebody who's in-house. Do you see differences in terms of how that adoption happens?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very big difference. And I can tell you, I've worked in agencies, and we've helped launch Neo, which is a lean consulting practice as well. And I can tell you this, it's very different in an agency than it is in-house. In an agency, you have to believe in this way of working, and because it changes your business model. And so if you're an agency that's been in business for a long time, the business that you've been in more than likely is the deliverables business. You've been selling specifications, and you've been selling prototypes, and maybe you've been selling code and designs and wireframes and so forth, and maybe research, right? If you're going to build a lean consulting practice, what you're actually in the business of is selling outcomes. And so you have to change what you're selling. And that's a big deal for a lot of agencies, especially those that have been around, because all of a sudden, the measure of success is not, did you give me 150 wireframes by August 31st? It's, did we get customers to change their behavior somehow by a certain date? Like, we still have to ship something. But the difference is that, and I can tell you this from firsthand experience, is that up front, you don't commit to fixed scope and fixed time, right? That's the traditional model. The traditional model says that on August 31st, we would deliver these 10 features. And I don't know about your experience, but in my experience, that's been a lie every single time, right? Because one of three things happens in those situations, right? We either move the, huh?
No, that's okay. I think there was just a static in between. Okay, you're good. Yeah.
But every time in my experience, in my career, that we've signed up for fixed time and fixed scope, three things have happened. One of three things: we move the deadline, we reduce scope, or we made everybody work 80-hour weeks for the last 3 weeks to get it done by the deadline, and then everybody quits and they go work somewhere else, right? That's not sustainable. And so, for example, Neo, the company that I work for, we sell time. You buy the team's time. Now, during that time, we will take our best guess, an estimate, about how much time we think we need to successfully change your customer's behavior based on what your outcome goals are. But because we build this highly collaborative model, you, the client, are there deciding, helping us decide how to spend that time, and you can make a very clear decision based on evidence about whether you want to buy more time or if we've spent enough time on this particular project. And that's really, it's fundamentally different in the way that you pitch the work, in the way that you deliver the work, and in what you actually sell. Now, the other thing that's really different in a services environment is the relationship you have with the client. Now, traditionally, agencies have been there to augment staff or to provide additional capacity when an organization can't do all the work it needs to do. And so what they used to do, at least and they continue to do today, is they send out an RFP, maybe a set of requirements, and an agency says, okay, that'll be $1 million, right? And it'll take 6 months. And they'll say, okay, $1 million in 6 months, and they sign the check. And then at the end of 6 months, the agency comes back and says, here's the thing, and the client either loves it or they hate it or somewhere in between. in our model, the client is part of the team. It's the only way to really get that level of collaboration and give the client a first-hand look at the evidence they need to make a really good decision about how to spend the subsequent time. And so for us, the client is on the team. They're coming to stand-ups, they're coming to iteration planning, they're coming to retrospectives, and they help us make decisions regularly about how to move the project forward. And that's key. And again, not all clients are open to that, because part of the reason they're hiring an agency is because they don't have capacity to take the work on themselves. And so what they're doing is that, in this case, so that's also a different part of the consulting side of this that makes this very different. So that's a really big challenge. Now there's one more challenge, because I was working with a team in Copenhagen earlier this year with this very similar challenge. A traditional design agency trying to move to a more lean model, but they don't really do any development. And so now you've got a third player. You've got the client, you've got the design agency, and now you've got the third-party development partner. And if they're not on board, now you've got three people that you need to align in a certain way of working. And that becomes a bit more challenging as well. And so you've got to make sure that everybody's on board and thinking about this the same way. I'll wrap up with this, because I know I've been talking about this for a while, but I have a lot to say about this. The best way to build alignment between all the players in a services situation like this is with a thing called, we call it the team working agreement. And it's a Google Doc that has very, very tactical lists, a list of how we will work together, right? When are stand-ups going to be? How, if we're a distributed team, what tool are we using for stand-ups? What are we using for chat? What are we using for document archives and file sharing? When are retrospectives? When are iteration planning meetings? Right? Source repository are we going? Source code repository are we going to use? Right? On and on and on and on to kind of make sure that everybody's on board, and it's a long meeting to get all that alignment, and then everybody signs it at the end. But it helps a lot. So that's one way to make it happen. But it's really different in an agency situation.
That's great. That's actually very interesting, because I think you're starting to talk about a little bit about the process and what the role of the developer is, what's the role of the PM is, and what's the role of the designer. So do you see, is there like an ideal process that you think that works for a lean UX to come plug into, and then in that, what's like a good role? How do you define roles of the designer, developer, and the PM in that team that works on that?
It's a really great question, because I think that in certain parts of providing a lean service, lean product development service, the roles get a little blurry, right? Because if we're doing a collaborative sketching session, a non-designer will contribute to the design.
Mm-hmm.
And often, these days, designers have some level of coding know-how. Typically some level of front-end development, maybe some Rails, right? And so there's an opportunity for non-engineers to provide some coding feedback or to do some coding of their own. And so I think it becomes a little bit blurry, and I think that's okay, right? So if an engineer is positively contributing to the design, let them contribute, right? And if a designer can positively contribute to the engineering side, let them contribute. Now look, ultimately, as we start to build more validation into the work that we're doing, people will start to move towards their core competencies, right? The designers will do most of the design, the engineers will do most of the coding. But I think initially it becomes, especially early on in a project, the roles get a little fuzzy, and that's okay, because we're trying to build an understanding of the problem that we're solving, the customer, our proposed solutions, and kind of everybody should contribute in whatever way that they can, at least early, and then later on, I think people kind of fall back into their traditional roles.
Right. So again, continuing on this topic about different types adopting, do you see there's a difference, or okay, let me put this way. How does somebody working in an enterprise environment, start using Lean UX? What are some of the challenges over there? And do you think does Lean UX does it even fit together when you're working with a legacy product or a service, and how does that work together?
Yeah, I've learned this the hard way. So the short answer, and I don't have any short answers to be perfectly honest, but the short answer is that yes, Lean UX works in a legacy environment. The longer answer is this, and I've learned this one the hard way several times, and then eventually stop making the same mistakes. The legacy environment has a tremendous amount of knowledge already there. Some of that knowledge is absolutely true, right? We have a good sense of who the customer is. We have a good sense of what problem they're trying to solve. We have a good sense of how we've solved those problems in the past, right? And so that knowledge exists. We have a good sense of how we've solved some technical challenges in the past, right? And we should make sure that we understand that knowledge that the organization already has before we jump in. And we should also get a good sense of what aspect of that enterprise knowledge is based on assumptions. And what's different today than when that enterprise knowledge was new. And then to see what we need to do to determine whether the gap is real or if it's perceived. And so if you're going to work in a legacy environment, don't disregard the work that's come before you, right? First of all, it's disrespectful to the people that you work with who did that work. Second, there's a tremendous amount to be learned there. So start your research there internally with the people who have been there for a while, who understand the systems and understand the clients and the domain and so forth. And then work your way towards kind of what's riskier, what are we not so comfortable with, or what's changed in our environment. Maybe there's a new player and it's shifting the way that people do their work. And that's where you start to sort of articulate those new assumptions, and that's where you can start running those tests. Now the nice thing is because you've got existing customers and you've got existing systems, you can start to get feedback much more quickly, real feedback from real people who use this type of software. And I think that the value there is tremendous in making sure that the improvements that you're making to the legacy product make sense and have value to the customer. So just to kind of wrap that up, I would say, use the in-house knowledge and leverage it to ask better questions.
Okay, so let me just take a break over here to announce to the people who are listening in into this Hangouts. If you have questions for Jeff, please tweet with the hashtag LeanUX, and one of us, Ramohan or I, will check that up and ask these questions to Jeff towards the end of this Hangout session. So Jeff, coming back to that conversation, I think recently, or maybe in May, when you talked at Enterprise UX conference, where you had this whole concept about innovation studios, were you talking about more, is that the case of, you think something like that would work in legacy systems, or is it only for large organizations trying to disrupt that they take up something like the innovation studios, and that's something that's going to work in that context?
The concept of the innovation studio is one that helps to create internal disruptive innovation practices inside companies. So the whole purpose of disruptive innovation is to move beyond the legacy system, right? It's to kind of relook at the space or an adjacent space in a new way, in a new light, and redefine how business is done, or the kind of business that the company does. And so the benefit of a legacy system is that it funds the innovation studio, right? The legacy business provides the funding for that potentially. But beyond that, really the purpose of that innovation studio concept is to disrupt the legacy business so that you don't get disrupted. In other words, you disrupt yourself as opposed to somebody else doing it for you. And I think that's the key differentiation.
Okay, nice. So going back to teams adopting Lean UX, how does that work with co-located teams versus remote teams?
Right. So there, and I've done it both ways. Look, the ideal situation is co-located teams. Right. That's the best situation, so that you can kind of lean over and talk to the engineer, the designer, the product manager, the business owner, whoever, and ask the questions and pull them over and have those conversations. That's ideal. That's not reality for most people today. Really, almost every company that I come across is not co-located. It's distributed in some way or another, and that's okay, right? That if that makes people more productive. The nice thing is that today, the tools that we need to create a collaborative session of any kind between distributed teams are available, right? If you work in an environment where you can use free tools, and you can use like Google Hangouts, Trello, Dropbox, Slack, right? Skype, whatever tools work for you to create those integrations. And if you work in an enterprise environment, there are tools that do that too, right? I mean, there's Yammer from Microsoft, and there's all kinds of tools essentially from Microsoft that allow you to do this kind of stuff. But there's one catch, right? That this is the toughest part of this whole thing with your distributed team, is that you have to be awake at the same time.
Right.
And so I'll give you an example. I'm in Barcelona right now, but I live in New York. I have some colleagues in Singapore who I like very much, and I would love to collaborate with them more regularly. But Singapore is it's a 12-hour time zone, 12 time zones away from New York. And so when they're waking up, we go to sleep. And when we go to sleep, they're waking up. And I'm sure that if you have colleagues in the United States, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so if you're not awake at the same time, you can't have a real-time conversation. And that's where the shared understanding and the collaboration stuff breaks down. So you can absolutely do this with a distributed team. You just have to be awake at not even for the whole day, right? So I have colleagues in the UK, and we overlap, 3-4 hours a day. And that's fine. We can do stand-ups, we can do some sessions, and that's fine.
Right. So I think when it comes to stand-ups and collaborating one-on-one, you have this video tools and other both synchronous and asynchronous communication tools that help you. But what if you were planning to do like sketching exercises or affinitizing exercises? How does that work out with remote exercises? Or even I'll just throw in that where how do you run a design studio with a remote teams?
Yeah, so I've done it, and I can certainly share the techniques. And again, I've done it a couple of different ways, and people can do them any way that they can, any way that works for them. The first time I ever ran a remote design studio, we used email, cell phones, and Skype. That was the first time we did it. So we had a team on the East Coast of the United States and a team on the West Coast. They were in Canada on the West Coast, and we sketched on paper, and then we took a photo of it with our phone, and then we sent the email around to a distribution list that included everybody in. We sent the photo to an email distribution list that included everybody in the group, and then we held the paper up to the camera and kind of walked people through it, but they could look at it on their screen. And that's how we built the collaboration there. Another time, that I did it was we used Google Draw. So Google Hangouts, the Google suite of products has a Draw product, and it works great. You can put an image in it, and people can sketch on top of the image, or you can carve it up, and you can see everybody's cursors in their drawing, and then they explain themselves. So that works. That's another way to do it. And then the third way that I've seen people do. I haven't done myself, but Trello is really good for this kind of stuff. You can create a board for it, and if everybody has the Trello app on their devices, right, you can upload a photo using the Trello app directly into a column, and then it pops up on everybody's screen, their big screen, and they can see it and they can discuss it there. You know, with some kind of a conference call service like this, or whatever else you like to use, right? So that's working really well. So those are three ways that I've done it. Slack just bought Screen Hero and has integrated Screen Hero into their product as well, which is screen sharing and so forth. So that's probably going to get there pretty soon as well. So you can absolutely do it, and the tools are there. Just get a little creative, and it works.
Any comments on UX of Slack, Jeff? It became only popular because of user experience, right? Though there are so many products in the market.
I don't. So look, it works, and I use it, and it's fine. I don't know why everybody loves it so much, but I don't understand. You know, my favorite comment is, we started using Slack, and our work email just went down, right? But for me, all that content is now in Slack, and I just miss about 75% of it, right? And so, is that better? Is that worse? Maybe. I don't know. Look, it works. It's fine. I understand. It's easy to use. Everybody seems to like it. You know, the GIFs are fun. So whatever. It's, you know, look. I'll tell you this much. Look, before Slack, we were using HipChat at Neo, and there's really, I mean, there are a few features in Slack that made us switch over, primarily private rooms. You know, like being able to create sort of client teams and then in-house teams specifically. But beyond that, pretty much the same experience, right? For me, anyway. So I don't understand the hype, but maybe it's just me.
Hey, just one follow-up question about you know, running UX activities with remote teams. So do you see having facilitators in all the remote locations, or one facilitator in one location able to, you know, run a design session across?
That's a great question. I've never done it with facilitators in the other locations. I've always been the facilitator, and I've only been in one location. So I don't know. That's a good question. It certainly would be helpful, I think, for somebody to have gone through the exercise in each location, but I don't think it's mandatory.
Yeah. Ramahan, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, Jeff, we have a question from Gaurav. What is the recommended level of border for Lean UX for learning and validating? Should we only focus till wireframes interactions?
What is the recommended level of what?
Of learning and validating. So I think he means until what level we should be.
I see. That's, you know, I don't know that you can quantify that. I think that the way that we approach that question, the way that I would approach it is this: ask yourself as a team, what is the most important thing that we need to learn next? And then once you kind of come to a conclusion of that, okay, the most important thing that we need to learn is X, then what's the least amount of work that you need to do to learn that? And then that least amount of work could be, you know, it may require a sketch, it may require a prototype, it may require you writing code, it may require just going and talking to customers. But as a team, you're going to have to decide, hey, we've gotten enough feedback on this to move forward. Now look, when it comes to qualitative feedback, you should start to see a pattern of response with your potential customers or your subject, your test subject, fairly quickly, right? So if you're asking the right questions, or you're asking questions consistently, and you're talking to the same kind of person, you should start to see a pattern between the fourth, the fifth person very quickly. You'll start to hear some patterns. And then, if you're sitting down with that sixth person or that seventh person, and you can pretty much predict the answers that they're going to say, then you've talked to enough customers, and you've probably got enough feedback, and you can move on to the next thing that you have to learn. But it's tough to say, it's X or it's Y. On the quantitative side, again, it really depends on how much traffic you currently have to your site, to your system, and what you're trying to learn. And I think that very, very quickly you can get a sense of whether or not this is something that is valid or not.
Right. I think this also goes back to something that you've started with when you said, Lean UX is all about the amount of depth at which you're doing versus the regular UX activities. So I think you've just touched upon, on a particular interaction or on a particular feature in terms of how much do you learn and how much do you validate, but also tying up with something that you talked about, you don't have the scope anymore. When you're following Lean UX methodology, you're not tying up with an entire list of features that you're starting with. So, but how much of it, like what depth do you go in terms of, so you started with one particular feature and then you've moved on and then you keep on moving on, or do you at some point also have an understanding that, these bunch of features would actually make sense and therefore we'll work together on them and then test them, is there, so I guess the question is twofold, is how much depth is good enough, and till what point do you keep continuing on working on that particular feature / product?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and it's a two-part answer. So the first answer is this: what is your definition of success? Right? You need to ask yourself as a team, what is success? What is done? Right? So in the traditional agile language, done or done, right, is shipped, is tested, works as designed, and shipped. Right? That's the traditional definition of done. And I would challenge that. I think that the definition of done should be, did we successfully ship something that changed customer behavior in a meaningful way? In other words, did we get customers to buy more stuff from us, or to sign up for the site, or to tell their friends, or whatever, to complete a task more efficiently? I think that's your definition of done. Shipping the feature is the beginning of that conversation. And so once you get something out the door, like the minimum version of that thing, you can start to understand where we need to optimize more. Does it need more design? Does it need more engineering? Does it need both? Does it need a different workflow, right? And every time that you run those tests and you build that learning, you get closer to done, closer to achieving that outcome, right? The phrase that I use, and I got it from my friend Jeff Patton, is outcomes over outputs, right? So output is shipping the features. That's the traditional definition of done. Outcomes is a change in customer behavior, which in a digital world we can measure, right? And so did we change customer behavior? That should be your definition of done. And I think that that's when you decide, hey, you know what? We've optimized this as much as we can. We're really getting people to do what we need them to do. We're going to move on to the next thing, right? So that's the first answer to that question. Now, at the beginning of that cycle, again, like you said, we don't necessarily want to work towards a finite, fixed list of features. We want to work towards a list of outcomes, a solution to a business problem. And the question that we have to ask then is, what are our assumptions? And I think that when you start a project, you're working from a list of assumptions, and most of those assumptions have some level of risk in them. Some are higher risk, some are lower risk. And so the level of fidelity of the work that you do to validate, to test those assumptions should reflect the amount of truth that you have in your assumptions. So at the beginning you have very little truth. And so the fidelity of your experiments and your MVPs should be very low. Paper prototypes, customer conversations, landing pages, right? Whatever you can do to move forward. As you get more validity into your learning, you can increase the fidelity of those tests. Maybe it's a concierge MVP. Maybe it's a live data prototype. Maybe you have to write some features and ship them to an A/B test, right? But and then ultimately those things become your features, right? And because you're measuring customer behavior as you launch and launch and launch, you can really push that. You can move in a more accurate direction with each iteration. Now the nice thing, and again to bring this back to Agile, is I really like how this plays well with Scrum. So ultimately Kanban as well, but let's just go with Scrum for a second, right? Scrum, you've got those fixed blocks of time, and those are your cycles. Those are your learning, iteration, and ultimately development cycles. And you've got a marker in time, a line in the sand that says at the end of a week or at the end of every 2 weeks, we're going to pause, we're going to get together as a team, and we're going to reflect on what we learned and where we should go next. Right? It's a perfect opportunity, and each one of those iterations is a learning, development, and production cycle, and research as well, because that's research is part of that process as well.
Okay. I think we have a question from Swapna on Twitter. She asks, does Lean UX fit in all cases? Where is it the best fit and where it does not fit in at all?
That's a great question. I think, look, so as a fixed methodology, you know, maybe, well, I'm trying to think about how to answer this. Look, here's what I think. I think that philosophically, lean thinking can apply in any situation, right? The minimum viable nature of your experiments will vary if you work in B2C e-commerce versus a space agency, right? But the philosophy of saying we want to reduce the risk of going too far in the wrong direction, and we want to prototype our thinking and test our thinking, I think works in all of this, you know, in all these situations. You know, as far as the methodology itself, look, like I said, I mean, there are certain situations where you will need to get very specific about certain things. And that's, you know, typically life and death situations, medical situations, right? We don't want to take too many huge risks. But again, if there's an opportunity to prototype, if there's an opportunity to learn, I think you're being lean in those situations, and I think you can apply them in any situation.
Okay. So, are there any gotchas or like mistakes that teams do while adopting Lean UX or practicing Lean UX that you've seen in your you know, other consulting businesses or, you know, teams that you work with?
Yes, absolutely. Many things. Let's see. So starting really kind of at the, so I'm going to talk about it at the team level, right? At the practicing level. I'm not going to talk about the management level, but at the practicing level. So I told you I made this mistake. It's diving into a legacy system and ignoring everything that's come before you. That's a big mistake. A lack of transparency is a huge mistake. I heard a story once about a guy that I know who used to work at a bank, and he begged his bosses to let them work this way. And then finally they said, okay, and they flew some people in from all over the United States, and they got a week They gave them a week, that's it, to try this out. And they stuck that team and they buried them in a conference room in the corner somewhere with the door closed. And at the end of that week, the team kind of came out and like, ta-da, we built this thing, isn't it great? And the organization was like we don't understand it, we don't get it, where did this come from, who did you talk to? Because they were completely hidden from the organization didn't believe anything that they told them. So transparency is so key. It's about getting getting everything out in the open and up on the walls and making sure that everybody can ask you questions and doing demo days front and center in front of the whole organization as much as you can. And so transparency is really key. And then I think the last thing, well, it's not the last, but another big gotcha, excuse me, is attempting to make a case. Getting people forgetting to make the case for their approaches based on the language that matters to the people they're trying to convince. And so it's really, and ironically, this is UX 101, right? UX 101 is know your customer, right? And I think the same thing holds true for Lean UX teams. Who are you trying to convince today? Today we're trying to convince the CTO that this is a good way to go. Terrific. What does the CTO care about? Okay, CTO cares about X, Y, and Z. How do we take our findings and phrase them in such a way that the CTO cares about them? Right? This will reduce the amount of time your engineers spend building the wrong product. Right? This will reduce the number of bugs written by your engineers, right? This will increase the uptake of the software. Whatever it is, right? Whatever it is that the people care about, that you're trying to convince, take your learnings from your research, from your validation efforts, and speak the language of those people. It's so critical, right? And I see so many teams do such great work and then hit the wall when it comes time to sell it to executives because they get all caught up in the language of product development, and it's really more about the business when it comes to convincing executives.
Right. So let's flip the coin, and why don't you talk about your favorite case study of a success of a team adopting Lean UX and what really came out of that?
Sure. There's two teams that come to mind immediately, and I'm really impressed with both of them for their efforts. The first team is PayPal. And I know PayPal is loved and hated all over the world, but I spent a lot of time with the PayPal organization back in 2012 and a little bit in 2013, and it's actually the reason I came to India. Was I came to work with the PayPal teams in Chennai, and look, despite being an internet native company, they had grown really big and really bloated, and their processes for getting anything out the door were ridiculous, and they realized that. And through a series of efforts, they've been working over the last two to 3 years to really transform the way that they build product, both technically, building a dev stack that allows you to go from prototype to production much more easily, but also from their upfront processes in product definition, validation, and design. And the way that they've gone about it is they had a top-down mandate, but they started off with a pilot team, a small team that took on one project, and they just tried it for 6 weeks, and it wasn't great. There were some wins, there were some losses, but there were a lot of learnings. And then they did it again, and again, and again, and then they did 2 teams, and 3 teams, and 4 teams, and they've been expanding that effort through training, through coaching, and through continued experimentation and improvement of their processes, of their dev stack, of their design processes, to become more lean, to become more nimble and more agile. My understanding is, and I haven't been involved with them for about 1.5 years, but my understanding is that they have moved significantly forward, that they continue to make strides. They're a big company. I mean, we're talking about 10,000 people roughly, And so they're continuing to move that forward. And keep in mind that they are hugely distributed. I mean, they're everywhere from California to India and everything in between. They've got offices. And so that's one company that I think has done a really interesting job. The other company that I started working with a little bit this year in the UK is AutoTrader UK. A fascinating story of a 30-year-old company that started off as a print-only magazine for selling your car. Right? You put an advertisement for the car that you want to sell, and people look there for cars that they may want to buy. And they used to have a massive staff, I think 3,500, 4,000 people, something like that, selling advertising and print advertising, and they moved into digital over the years. And then recently, they've gone fully digital. And they've streamlined the organization to be about 900 people. And they have a near monopoly on the market in England, in the UK at the moment. And what's amazing is that they've reorganized their product development teams into these cross-functional collaborative squads. Very much like if you're familiar with the Spotify model, the concept of the squad, kind of like the smallest unit. So product design, engineering together, and each one of those squads has a customer behavior, essentially, that they're targeting. And that their job is to optimize that behavior. And they are encouraged to get out of the building, to prototype, to learn, and to bring those features back to the teams to make real-time decisions very, very quickly. And I had the pleasure of working and training that team a little bit earlier this year, and really blown away by how much they've bought in, because they've bought in not just in process, right? So philosophically they're bought in, process-wise they're bought in, but they're investing in the technical infrastructure to support this way of working. So they're not only investing in people going out and talking to customers, but they're investing in continuous deployment and integration and making sure that they can get these ideas out into market very quickly, to measure how they're affecting customer behavior, and then to optimize or to roll them back based on those learnings as much as they can. And so those are two of my favorite case studies in recent memory.
That's nice. Actually, that's very interesting when you draw parallels with, something like service design, and you're looking at teams looking at a touch point, but now you're talking about how does a team impact a customer behavior. I think that adds a lot more to it, rather than just looking at a touch point and seeing what interaction happens, but then you're looking at the outcomes, like how we were just talking about a little earlier.
Yeah, I mean, look, the question, right, and this is, I think, the biggest takeaway from all of this is to continually ask yourselves, so what? Right? That's really it, right? Hey, we shipped it. So what?
Yeah.
Did customers use it? Did it make them better at their job, or happier with whatever it is, right? Continue to ask yourself, and if you don't know the answer to that question, go get the answer and then fix the product if you didn't make a difference.
Right. So one of the things is getting to these case studies and listening to them is very inspiring, and it actually gives you some ideas in terms of what you could do and how you could take on your journey. So are there any resources that people can look up to for looking at case studies like this? Or are you working on putting together something, maybe a book or a blog around this in terms of case studies on how different teams have adopted what they're doing?
I wish I could point you towards kind of one main resource of case studies. I think there are definitely some, and I think that if you keep an eye out on the LeanUX hashtag on Twitter, good case studies pop up in there. There was a really good one from Spotify recently about how they developed their running feature. Brendan Marsh, who's the product guy there, was the Agile coach for that product team, who I met in Stockholm earlier this year, wrote a really detailed blog post about how they kind of practice this at Spotify. And I retweet this stuff all the time, and so you can follow me, and I'll retweet that as well. I am working on a new book with Josh Seiden, but this new book is going to be a business book. And the business book, it'll be focused really more holistically on the organization. So how do you manage a company to help?
Sensing book?
Sensingbook.com, yes. Exactly. And so you can sign up there for on our mailing list, and we'll send you a note when the book comes out. And that'll be out next year sometime. And there'll be lots and lots of case studies there of companies using technology to transform their business. So not necessarily Lean UX specific, but kind of more org-wide about how to make this happen.
Right. So just taking up on a question by Yagnesh on Twitter, where he asks about what's like a good tool for prototyping. I think I'll just add on to that. Would you also talk about your favorite method in UX space and a good tool that or your favorite tool for prototyping and building prototypes or wireframes or whatever in the design space?
Got it. It's a great question. I mean, the prototyping, again, I don't have a clear answer for this, but I mean, it really depends on how much time you have and what you're trying to learn. Look, I'm going to say it. I've used Keynote for prototyping, because I can build an interactive prototype very, very quickly. I use Balsamiq because I can very, very quickly put together an interactive prototype. We've used InVision a lot to tie together wireframes that we've drawn in Sketch. So Sketch is really popular right now in our studio as well. What else? I mean, we do a lot. I mean, there is a lot of hand coding prototypes as well.
So how does your collaborative sessions play in with the tool that you choose?
How does what play in?
Your collaborative sessions, whether you're like sketching with a developer, a PM, is there a tool that you think works really well in that kind of?
Post-it notes and a pen. Yeah, I mean they work the best. I mean they really do, right? I mean that's kind of like the lowest risk and the lowest investment, and those really work well. I've done Google Draw with remote engineers to kind of sketch out ideas and get them working in that. Any kind of a shared whiteboard really works well, and that's the one that I like. That works well for me.
And any favorite UX method that you have?
What do you mean by UX method?
Maybe, well, if you call a design studio as a method, or
I see.
different types of methods that you could pick up, depending on what stage you are in. But there are one that you really like, and coming back to that again and again.
The most powerful one is talking to customers. I mean, really. I mean, I can't stress that enough. I mean, build a regular conversation with your customers every week. 1 day a week, talk to 3 or 4 customers every week. Just build that regular that dialogue with the market on a regular basis. It's absolutely worth it, and I can't stress that one enough. That's the most important one.
Okay, awesome. And I think we are almost nearing the end, and we have a question from Balaji. I guess this is going to be the last one. So Balaji asks, how much does culture influence over Lean UX?
It's huge. Look, I mean, I'm going to quote my friend Jeff Patton. Process is a reflection of culture. Okay, so the processes that we use reflect how we work together. If the organization values learning, then lean thinking and lean UX and so forth work really well in that company, right? Because we want to make sure we learn quickly and reduce risk. If the organization still has that kind of industrial era model of we're a software factory and we got to get stuff out the door, that's going to make lean UX very difficult to practice inside your company. And so culture makes a big difference. And you can chip away at it, right? Again, like I told you, by showing the evidence and dragging people out to talk to customers and so forth. But the culture determines a lot. Now, the good news is, if you work in a situation where culture is pretty stiff and not conducive to this way of working, there is so much disruptive activity going on in every industry that inevitably people inside your company are going to realize that if they don't change something, they're going to go out of business. And so that should move things forward. Now, look, as a last resort, and I'll say this, I don't know what it's like in India, what the markets are like in India, but I can tell you that certainly in the United States and in Western Europe, it's a really good time to be in technology. There is lots and lots of demand for designers and for engineers and for product managers, and not enough people to go around. So if the culture is tough and you're not enjoying your work, consider looking around. That's what I would say.
I guess we are towards the end. Any closing comments, Jeff, before we close out? Or if you want
I'll say that,
something.
Sure. So a couple things. First of all, thanks so much for having me. This was fun. I really enjoyed it, and I hope it was helpful to you and the folks listening. Second, if you didn't get your question answered, feel free to email me. My email address is jeff@neo.com, neo.com, jeff@neo.com. So just email me, and I'll be happy to answer it. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll plug two things. First, again, we have a new book coming out next year, sensingbook.com, SENSING book.com is a place to put your name on our email list, and if you're interested, please sign up. And then the last thing that I'll plug is we're putting on a conference in New York at the end of October called Lean Day NYC, and you can get all the info on it at leandaynyc.com. And it's a really great event. I'm really excited about it, and it really kind of deals with a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today. So that's it for me, and I really appreciate this was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Jeff. And I guess I didn't even realize we have been talking away for an hour almost, and yeah, we've got lots more questions, and I guess we'll keep in touch on Twitter and email, and you'll be having some questions coming in through your email.
Terrific. Thanks again, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks a lot, and most probably we'll catch you next year for the Lean Conference India.
Sounds fun.
Okay. Have a good day. Have a good vacation. Get back to
All right. All right. Done.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.